Well, I'm sure people will start wandering in. We'll go ahead and get started. I'll explain some of these. I put the mini version up, and I realized when I walked in, nobody can see it. Just made it bigger, and it's terrible, but I'll explain that. We're looking in Luke chapter 1 today at some of the last of the songs, the second of the songs that are sung or considered songs, and that's Zechariah's song, the Benedictus, based on blessing is the word. And then we're looking at angels and their messages, and whether we get to Wisemen or how much we talk about Wisemen is another story, but that'll be next week. So we'll see how much we get through today. A lot of this is based on the Old Testament. These are, again, people who are rich in their understanding of their own songs and their own history and what God has promised them throughout that, the prophets and even up back to Moses. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Father, we're thankful for our time together, and we're thankful for your blessings, and we're thankful that we can be together. May we always serve you, and may we praise and honor you in all that we do. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, Zechariah's song begins in verse 67. This is after the birth of John. Remember the angel Zechariah had some questions, and so he hasn't spoken for 9 months or so. And so Elizabeth says, what are you going to, or people say, what are you going to name the child? Elizabeth says, John. John, nobody has a name John in your family. And so Zechariah takes something and writes, and then after he writes down John, he's able to speak again. So verse 65, the neighbors were filled with awe, and throughout the hill country of Judea, people were talking about all these things. And on our map here, and I'm not really in a good place, this would be the hill country up north of Jerusalem. Is probably where Elizabeth and Zechariah lived. So again, it's really scale map here, in great detail. I'm disappointed that Bibles today don't have maps in them. That's what makes it so frustrating. I have this new Bible, not a map to be seen, and I've looked at some others, but I can read this one, so that's the way it goes. I like maps. I like to look at maps. That's why I have these two up here for another reason. Zechariah begins to speak, filled with the Holy Spirit, and prophesied, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, because he has come to his people and redeemed them." Now that goes back to some of the, similarities of events that occurred in the Old Testament, the redeemed aspect, and you can pull out any number of them. Isaiah 40, people returning from captivity. So that idea is seen through 40 to 55. 13 times he uses the Holy One of Israel who's redeemed you type of thing. And so that's just one of a number of events that are that they will appeal to. And in Zechariah's day, the Romans occupied the country, and so they're still under foreign domination. And these events are recalled from the past. He's raised up a horn of salvation for us. That's the horn more like a power, but you can, again, look at some of the texts that speak about horns, Daniel and others. Psalm 18, 2 and following. In the house of the servant David, obviously the king is coming. Verse 70, as he said through his holy prophets long ago. And that would be Ezekiel in particular. Chapter 34, 36 mentions David. But there are Micah, which Luke doesn't mention. Micah 5:2, Bethlehem would be the birthplace of the Messiah. At least that's what the Pharisees thought. So, salvation from our enemies and from the hand of all who hate us. And let me just get a concordance out and just go look for some of these Old Testament references. You'll find this one like in Psalm 106:10. That's a pretty popular song for them. To show mercy to our ancestors, to remember his holy covenant, Genesis, that he swore to our father Abraham. So it's a recalling again of God's promise, what God said he would do, make all the nations will be blessed by the seed of Abraham. To rescue us from the hand of our enemies, to enable us to serve him without fear and holiness and righteousness before him all our days. And so these are, again, the themes are similar to some of the Psalms and similar to the prophets. Redemption, rescue, save us from our enemies. Give us, now, what they expected and what God planned are two different things. He would rescue them, yes, but they're not the way they thought. And their expectation was, we're going to kick Rome out. And they've had a little history of that. Another event that occurs this time of year is Hanukkah, and that's the Festival of Lights. That's the story of the rebellion of the Jews against Antiochus the fourth, who offered a pig on the altar in Jerusalem, and then got himself into a civil war and lost. And so the Jews kicked them out of Jerusalem and basically tried to rule for a number of years, and it was an on and off again thing. But so that's they're recalling. That's even an event not that far back in their history that they can recall the idea of being rescued, and of course the Festival of Lights, the idea of the candle being lit and only enough oil for one day that goes 8 days, and the temple is cleansed and so forth. Great story. I mentioned last week 613. If you type that in, it's a Jewish a cappella group, and they sing about two events, Hanukkah and Passover. And they use The Lion King, Hamilton, some of the West Side Story, and some other ones. And they tell the story through these songs the tunes are familiar, but they tell the story. And it's in a video so that you have them acting some of that out. And it's a lot of fun to watch. But that's the idea. We tell stories in our songs. And this is what Zechariah is doing. And so in 76, he says, "And you, my child, will be called the prophet of the Most High." So now he is now repeating what the angel basically told him. "For you will go on before the Lord to prepare the way for him." Malachi 3, Isaiah 40 again. "Give his people the knowledge of salvation through the forgiveness of their sins, because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the rising sun will come up to us from heaven, to shine on those living in darkness and the shadow of death, and to guide our feet in the path of peace." Obviously, he's looking to what John's message will be. And let me say this. This is supposed to be a discussion class. I get going. So if you have a question or want to make a comment, you're going to have to throw it out, because I get wound up. He says here, the shadow of death. That's a kind of a popular phrase. Psalm 23, verse 4, talks about the shadow of the valley of death, and or the deepest darkness where the shepherds go through. And there's some other references in Scripture. And so it's kind of a metaphor for the struggles that one is in, the darkness. If you look at Lord of the Rings and Mordor, it was always dark until it blew up. So that's sort of the idea that's being expressed there. And even in the prequel that's on Amazon Prime, Mordor was there, and then when it blew up, and it turned dark. And so darkness was an indication again of not the lack of sunlight, but just the evil that is around. And so oftentimes the prophets use the sun going out or disappearing, not because it's going to literally disappear, but because there is evil times or darkness coming in the form of, again, evil and death and sin. And so 80 says the child grew and became strong in spirit, and he lived in the wilderness until he appeared publicly to Israel. And who were we talking about? We talked about this sometime, not necessarily in this class. John was ate locusts and honey and was dressed kind of like Elijah and wandered around the wilderness, which, some people would say, a little out of his mind, but that's what God wanted him to do, and part of his Nazirite vow. So he must have been a character to see as far as if you came across him. But people went to hear him. They wanted to see. He was I don't know if celebrity is a good word, but he was an attraction. People went up to see him and to see what he was saying, and the message was taking root with the common people, not so much the Pharisees and Sadducees. And so that's two of the songs that we see. The next one will center around the birth of Christ. Again, days of Caesar Augustus. We are, just to highlight some of this, and there's a lot of things we don't know. For instance, was Mary living with her parents, or was she an orphan? I just read that this week. She may have been an orphan, but those are just things we do not know about some of the events in the story. Why was Joseph in Nazareth? And was that where his father had moved to get a better job because carpenter or mason or something like that? Anyway, there Nazareth is here. Mary's pregnant. Joseph, and we'll get to that story in Matthew's account. But Joseph, after an angel appears, accepts that the situation. Now, it's an honor and shame culture, so if a woman is pregnant and not married, again, betrothed requires a divorce, the husband is preparing the house, but there's no hanky-panky between them until all that's done, and now she's pregnant, and can you imagine saying to your parents, I'm pregnant, you and Joseph have been away. It's not Joseph. What? Who is it? An angel? I mean, a little, okay, so, anyway, ridicule, we have to picture, this is not necessarily the sweet, nice pictures that we want to draw at this time of year. They were probably ridiculed, they were looked on, frowned upon. It was a close society. Nazareth wasn't a metropolis, it was like 400 people. These were little villages scattered throughout.
Nazareth was kind of looked down on anyway, was it?
Yeah, apparently, for some reason they were. I don't, and that's really not clear as to why, but yeah, they were, anything good could come out of there, so I don't know what reputation they had, but whatever it was, they certainly earned it. So we don't know when Joseph and Mary left Nazareth, how far along she was. Obviously at least 3 months, and she wasn't giving birth yet. So typically, again, Samaria is in the middle of the country, so it's a problem. Main road on the west coast, a lot of traffic, Romans, a whole bunch of caravans and trade route and so forth from Damascus to Gaza, things that were, the Silk Road would be going north, but they could come down through to Egypt. Maybe some spices along this way. Next week we'll talk about another trade route. So they would come down, cross the Jordan, north of Samaria, down the west side, or east side of the Jordan River. Apparently there was some type of trail through there. I saw that on one map. This is the King's Highway. It's known even today as the King's Highway. From and Amman, it would be somewhere in this area, I think, modern day Amman in Jordan. But Damascus is in Lebanon, so they would travel down, or Syria. They would travel down this main road as a trade route from the south, deep south, at the end of the Arabian Peninsula, and ships coming across from Africa as well as trade coming from the east. So this minor little path in here is probably the way most of them went. Water was available then, and somewhat safety. They would also probably travel in a group and not by themselves, just for safety reasons. And certainly a 14-year-old girl wouldn't be left out there. But even Joseph, if he was 15 or 16, or Mary, they'd probably take that safe route. To Jericho, which is on the west side of the Jordan, they crossed there, and then up to Bethlehem. Jericho, have you ever wondered why there were so many tax collectors in Jericho? Zacchaeus, Matthew, and they're always surrounded by tons of tax collectors, because this was an entry point. Trade came through here. It wasn't a major point, but it was a point. Rome wanted its money. It needed its money to supply its army. But it also wanted its wealth. And so it needed money to buy things. Spices again, and silk and so forth. So, and this stuff was surprisingly, in reading about this, India, China, these places were known to the ancient world. It wasn't ignorance that we see, that we might think of. They knew of these places. And so those trades came through there.
George, that main highway, that's probably coastal flatlands, but the one along the Jordan, is that kind of in a valley flat?
No, it's about 3,000 feet up, and it's, when we rode on it, it was fairly easy to ride on. There seemed to be a flat area. Yeah, I mean, a little up and down hills, but no, when we got off going to Petra, when we got off this thing, it was horrible. There's maybe 2-lane roads, and they were not straight, and they had sharp turns. So it was, but the main road, the King's Highway, seemed to be fairly.
So the
level.
path that they were walking on was probably pretty easy walking?
Yeah, and down here probably the same, because there's not a lot of there's a valley. It's a valley, so Israel's mountain range would be here, and then Jordan's mountain range would be here. So this is the valley, and it's pretty level in there. Not necessarily bush-free. You might have to walk through some bushes to get some places because it's overgrown, depending on it. But once you commit a path, it goes over and over. Comment?
Okay, yeah. I just want to comment about Nazareth. I mean, this was a prophetic thing, and I'm sure that the city, if you doom the city before Christ is born, it would make it extremely difficult, because isn't the fact to say that a person from Nazareth is called a Nazarite or Nazarene? So, And I think what the Nazarite or the Nazarenes were required to do, of course, not to mingle with the local celebrations, like getting drunk, and not to eat as a glutton, and not to partake in all these other things, just to be separated or separate. And so now when Christ was born, we made it even difficult, because now he's out of Nazareth.
Yeah.
All places.
Nazareth had and it's not an Old Testament thing, because there's no Nazareth in the Old Testament, but it's connected with, the root word is connected with branch. So Isaiah 11. So Nazareth there was a connection there, but again, it's kind of scholars debate how all that plays out. And again, what they were like or what was going on there. It seemed to be a pretty hostile place at times. They were perfectly happy to a point, but in Luke 4, that's where Jesus was when he proclaimed the day of the Lord, and then he said, in the days of Elijah, there were a lot of lepers, but only Naaman got healed in his day. Or is it the other way? Yeah, that's Elijah. And in the days of Elijah, it was the widow. There were a lot of widows, but only, and that drove them nuts. And they tried to throw them off a cliff. So it's not a popular place that one would live to. Bethlehem, same thing, small town, probably 400 or 500 people at best. Lots of shepherds. So it may have been a scattered area and not, you could be in Bethlehem, but it's sort of like spring. You can be in spring and how many different places are climbed or something like that, and you need road signs to tell you that you're going across. So, but a little village, this is sort of the idea of the village. Again, I don't know what best to stand. A little fence around, some type of structure around, no walls. Walls have been destroyed long before. Remember, there were captivities and carryings off and the tax and all that. So what was left of Bethlehem was just kind of a small area. There may be several of these around in the general area. Not necessarily 5 houses, but each square or whatever that is, rectangle, represents a house. They would kind of build it like that because it was a community affair. They didn't have, you can't order a stove for every house. The little circle in the middle would be the primary baking area. And so they would share in the baking and the bread and so forth. So there was a lot of community involved in this. The sort of the fence kind of protected things. There are a lot of lions and tigers and bears. Well, maybe not tigers, but lions and bears in the Bible. Okay, so we know wild animals were wandering around. They entered Bethlehem. Our tradition is there was no room for them in the inn. Problem was there was no inn. I'm sorry, but Tom Baudet had not opened his Motel 6 yet in Bethlehem. So what does inn mean? And that has been a little bit of a debate. But the word inn means upper room or guest room. And we see that in Luke 22, where Jesus and the disciples or apostles meet for the Last Supper in an upper room. Same word. The word inn is used in Luke chapter 9 or 10, where the parable of the Good Samaritan. That is literally the word for motel, inn type of thing. That one's in Jericho. So there were not a lot of, there were places to stay along these roads that we were talking about if they were in the main areas, main highways. And so there were places people could stay. If you had money, better quality. So, and some of them were notorious in other ways. But if you were off in a small village somewhere, there's no inn. So that's one thing. Second thing is when they got there, and there's no inn, if it's an upper room, I'll explain that in a minute, but in Jewish and Middle Eastern culture, people, you wouldn't be allowed. I mean, the honor shame society, it would be shameful to leave somebody in the middle here sleeping at night. You would invite him in or them in and take care of him. So the hospitality aspect would play an important role. And third, Joseph's hometown. So he's got family there, and family's going to invite you in. We don't know how close, maybe uncles, maybe cousins, but hey, Joseph! And they're going to supply a place for him, and where he can sleep, we're marrying him to sleep. Don't know exactly how far along she was when they get there, because it's all condensed in a real tight space. But it may have been weeks or maybe a month or two before she gave birth. So if you're looking at a house in the ancient world, two types come to mind. This is the just general one-story house, very simple. Living area, that means everything. Sleeping, eating, visiting, everything's done there. And kids are there. If you remember the story Jesus tells of the fellow who comes, knocks on the door and says, I need some bread, and the guy responds, well, we're all asleep. The kids are in bed, and it's not that they're in their different rooms, we're just all asleep here in the middle. So that's the idea. You would enter here, and the first thing you see is area for animals. Animals were important. Goats provided milk. They were part of the economy. You can't just misplace an animal. You can't afford to lose an animal. The wool, the eggs, whatever it was, had to be taken care of and protected. Now they could wander around some today because maybe people will be out and moving around to watch things, but not at night, at night, it's dark, and it's not like, we have street lights most of the time, some places, but if you've ever been, you're in a dark area, and there's no light, it's kind of dangerous, so there's that idea. And then there's an upper room, if you're able to, not all houses would be some stairs or a ladder. The upper room may be attached to the one side or be on the roof. So you'd have to climb up there, so that's kind of the idea. Judges 11, story of Japheth. He makes an oath, everybody talks about that, how could a man make such a stupid oath? But this explains why. What do you think's coming out of that house? He didn't think it would be his daughter. He thought some goat would come out. And he could offer up a goat, no problem. He was surprised his daughter came out. So it kind of helps understand that story. The second type of house is just two-story, basically. Everybody lived up here, ladder to get up there, animals under here, protected either by fence or some type of barrier. Some talk about some of these houses were built next to the cave or be in front of caves, so the animals put in the caves and then protected that way. Some of that was open area, so they couldn't always do that. So different types of houses to protect people. So that kind of gives an idea of why it's not an inn, but an upper room. And Matthew's account seems to say that Joseph and Mary decided to settle there. Because when the Wisemen show up, they go to a house. All right. We now have shepherds out there in the fields. For some reason, shepherds have been taking a beating of recent years among scholars. I really didn't know why, but in the Hebrew scriptures, you have David as a shepherd, the Lord is a shepherd, Moses was a shepherd, Abraham was a shepherd. Shepherds were supposed to watch over the people, Ezekiel, again, 34 to 37, somewhere in there. So the shepherds had a more positive, the Lord's my shepherd, I shall not want type of thing. So a more positive role, it seemed like. But the first century, a lot of things have changed. So we get to this time frame of Augustus and Herod the Great and a corrupt priesthood. And so now you have some issues. Who can come to the temple and who can't? And the shepherds were out in fields and they were with the sheep and, dead animals, and when you touch a dead body, again, parable of the Good Samaritan. You don't want to touch a dead body. Don't want to. I'm clean. Want to stay clean. And so there were some issues there, and of course other things. Shepherds being out there and smelly and so forth. So and apparently, and again, there may be some debate on this. Bethlehem was sort of an area where the sheep were prepared for the sacrifices, and so it was sort of an area where one of the areas where they would provide sheep, provide lambs, and so lots of shepherds, and just maybe too much for the upper class of priests. Bethlehem wasn't the only place, by the way. So the type of sheep they had in Israel at this time was probably birthing, surprisingly, between November and January. And not European style, which is a little like in the spring, but the temperature in Jerusalem today is probably, excuse me, like here. Pretty nice. Days are pretty nice, warm, 50s, 60s. You're in the hidden mountains, so it'll be a little cool at night, 30s. Maybe a lot cold, I don't know. All I know is when we were at Petra, which is down there, my daughters decided, hey, let's camp out type of thing in a metal TV-like building. You want to do that, Dad? Oh, sure, why not? I'm going for anyway, so I might as well, I'm going to not complain about it. So beautiful day, walking around, even nice sunset. 10 o'clock at night, 30 degrees. And the heat was not sufficient to get the thing warm. And talk about getting up in the night to go to the bathroom, oh, it was terrible. It was cold in those mountains.
No, this is a quick question on the map. Did you, before I got here, did you say how far the distance between?
90 miles.
It was 90 miles, okay.
I didn't say that, but yeah, 90 miles.
So,
And again, that, as the crow flies, I guess, whoever, they built churches wherever they found something important in the ancient world, so in the 4th, 5th century. And you will probably find in several churches saying Jesus spent the night here, or Mary and Joseph spent the night here, and it just straight down. That's an assumption. But they forget about Samaria. Samaria was that wasn't the safest place to go through as a Jew, because they were somewhat conflict. So probably again, the things we don't know. So if someone said, no, they went straight down, well, okay, I can live with that. It's not something big. Angels appear to these shepherds out in the middle of the fields. And verse 10, verse 9, the angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. Typical response. But the angel said, do not be afraid. Typical response. Angels, when they come with a message, if it's a good message, they'll say, don't be afraid. And I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people. Today in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He's the Messiah of the Lord. This will be a sign to you. You'll find the baby wrapped in clothes and lying in a manger. And then suddenly a great company of heavenly hosts appeared with the angel, praising God and saying, glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth peace to those on whom his favor rests, or peace and goodwill among men. So the angels appear. They have a message. It's a short message. The sign is the baby wrapped in swaddling clothes. The only Old Testament reference I really could find was a reference in Ezekiel 16 about swaddling clothes. There's some stories wrapped around about sheep and all that, but most shepherds say that's not true. What was I going to say here? There was something. Oh, town of David. Bethlehem was where David grew up. I hadn't mentioned that. Bethlehem was a small town. It became his. It wasn't where his palace was built. That was Jerusalem, but Bethlehem was known as the town of kings. So Bethlehem was David's sort of getaway type of things, like Camp David is. Kind of strange. I hadn't thought about that connection there. Camp David, I don't know, I'm sure it's not named after the same person, but the president wants to get away, he goes to Camp David. So anyway, the song is pretty simple. There's a lot of text we could all find. I've got one from number 6, which is the blessing, the Lord bless you and keep you and make his face to shine upon you. Psalm 72, Zechariah 8, and Isaiah 9, 5 and 6. A child is born, a son is given, and call him Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. So there are some references in that sense. The angels left. I always think about this, is if you're out in the field and these angels appear to you in this great light, and you're 5 miles away and you look there and you say, what's that light? I think there'd be some curiosity when we see old Sam the next day at the watering hole. We're going to have to ask him what that light was about. Did you see that light last night? Type of thing, And then you have to wonder if 30 years later, if they thought about this event when Jesus started preaching. Anyway, they run to the village. Wouldn't be hard to find where the baby was born. If they're villagers or they're connected with Bethlehem, obviously they knew who was pregnant and who would maybe be due. Oh, now she had a baby, that type of thing. If they didn't know and they went, it wouldn't be hard to find, because there'd be a bunch of guys standing outside warming themselves by a fire, because they were all kicked out of the house so that the mother could give birth. And I don't know whether you've seen any pictures of how this is done, or video that kind of displays it, but they don't give birth the way we would normally think a woman would give birth. Let's just put it that way. It was an interesting affair. And that's why you throw the husbands out, because one screaming person is enough, you didn't need to have it. So I'm just, a little stereotype there, but that's sort of the way it may have been. They find him, they spread word about him. These are these little phrases that pop up. Shepherds are spreading word. Do people think about this 30 years later? I remember some baby. He had an unusual name. And I saw him wrapped in clothes in a manger. Is this the guy? Is this the Jesus that I saw? So you have to kind of wonder if people thought about that.
You said uncommon name, but wasn't Jesus a very common name?
Well, that's right. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said it that way.
Okay.
Yeah. But is this the Jesus that would be better? Is this the Jesus of one of many? Is this the one that we're thinking about? Yeah. Jesus, Mary, Joseph. Well, yeah, Joseph. Lots of a fellow named Richard Bachman wrote a book and looked at all the names, and he found that names like Mary and Jesus, and Jesus is Joshua. If you look into the Old Testament, there's a lot of back and forth there. No, I mean, there's Jesus is Joshua, and then other names pop up. Not that many different names, not like the variety we have today. So that's why you'll see in text Joseph of Arimathea. It's the Joseph from Arimathea, or the sons of Zebedee. These are Zebedee's sons. So they're identified, because there's others, Johns and James and Simons and all that. And sometimes Marys show up in the multitude of Marys in one text, and you go, oh, which Mary is he talking about? It also helps, it causes some problems with James and the book of James, and James in 15, Acts 15, and James the brother of Jesus, and the one who was killed, and so forth. So the shepherds go away praising God, which is what they were supposed to do. Mary treasures up these things in her heart. I think Mary, did you know the song? It's probably a pretty good song that she asks these questions. Who is this child? She's a mother, she's excited, but then things start to happen, and you have shepherds show up, and Wisemen show up, and you go to the temple, and that's Simeon and Anna, just real quick down to 22 and following of Luke 2. And Simeon comes along and says in verse 29, Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, you may now dismiss your servant in peace, for my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all nations, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of your people Israel. Isaiah 49:6, that last verse there. This is considered a song. It's a little poem that Simeon states, but all these people start showing up and saying things, and she's got to start thinking, what's going on here? And then you go along, and life seems to be going okay, and kids and everything, and all of a sudden at age 12, they go to Jerusalem for a festival, and they leave, and thinking Jesus is among, somewhere in the crowd of this caravan, and then they realize he's not there, and they go back, and 3 days later they find him in the temple talking to the priest, and why weren't you with us? And we've been worried about you, and I'm about my father's business. And okay, now she's got something a pre-teenager, now she's gotta think about what does that mean? You know, so she's got a lot to ponder in her life. And then even when you think about, he's out there preaching and people think he's crazy, or the cross. And she's still pondering things. What's the meaning of all this? I mean, I had the angel appear to me, I had the message, I had all these people, all this stuff, and now he's dead. What does all that mean? So she's had a lot to think about. Okay, I think that's everything we're going to look at in Luke 2. Again, the angel song is in verse 14, short thing, and then Simeon's was the fourth song that we're going to look at. Next week we'll look at Matthew 2. Get the right one. Matthew 2, just kind of talk a little bit about the Wisemen, but we'll probably talk about a couple other things. Any questions or comments anybody want to throw out? Or if not, thanks for coming.